Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. Here it is, the Monday edition of Point of View, and I'm so grateful that you were able to join us today. This hour, I want to look at some of the issues in the news. We have a $900 billion coronavirus relief bill where there's agreement on it. We don't have a final vote, but I think that is now a foregone conclusion. So much so that some of the people in the Trump administration are suggesting that stimulus checks will go out as early as next week. Now, for all the skeptics out there, remember, those are the same skeptics that told us we wouldn't have a vaccine until 2021. You know, the ones they've been actually vaccinating people with. So, again, sometimes these predictions are a little bit off. Many times they turn out to be accurate. And nobody in the mainstream press ever seems to apologize because of their skepticism. But that's where life goes. Do want to get into the vaccines a little bit later. The FDA is investigating some of the allergic reactions. And, of course, if you are on Facebook or Twitter or anything, you've seen the video by now of the nurse who, after being vaccinated, starts talking and then fades over and faints. And so, of course, everybody's making a big deal out of that. But, you know, those kinds of things might happen. But we will cover these, especially as there might be an attempt to cover up some of this. So we'll get into that. And then when we talk about how these vaccines are going to be actually allocated, I was sure this had to be a fake news story. Unfortunately, I guess not. Some of the states have actually decided to put minorities in front of whites in terms of receiving the vaccine. So we're going to use kind of an affirmative action with the way in which vaccines are put forward. Andrew Yang has a good idea, and that is that in order to make sure that we have a possible opportunity to check whether or not somebody has been vaccinated, how about we have a barcode that you would carry along? Some people are suggesting maybe you could put that on the forehead or the back of the hand. You can see where that's going. So we'll get into that as well. Questions about election irregularities, election fraud. Another court case, which also brings me to the fact that Rod Dreher will be with us at 2 o'clock today as we talk about not only his book, Live Not by Lies, but wrote some very good pieces, which we've posted on his observation of the Jericho March. And since there's supposed to be something similar to that on January 6th, well, we'll see where that goes. But at 1 o'clock, we'll also be talking with Dale Kreienkamp, I think that's how you pronounce his name, and he actually has put together a very good devotional for people that have lost their job, and actually has an organization called Thriving Through Transitions, helping people that have lost their job. And, of course, every year, tens of millions of people lose their job. Well, that's almost doubled during the pandemic, so we thought we might do a little practical application here as well. But let's get into the $900 billion coronavirus relief bill. What is in it? Oh, my. There's a lot. First of all, let's recognize that once this is passed, and it will be passed probably by today, certainly by tomorrow at the latest, Congress will then have approved legislation that have appropriated more than $4 trillion to respond to the pandemic and hundreds of thousands of deaths that have resulted from that. What is in the bill? Okay, stimulus checks. First of all, those stimulus checks will not be as generous as the ones in March. It will be, payments will be up to $600 per adult and per child. This is about half of the $1,200 payments that people had under the CARES Act, which was enacted back in March, but the amount is slightly larger than the $500 that was allocated to the child. So everybody, whether you're old or young, gets $600 unless you made so much money you don't get it. Okay, so that's the stimulus checks, and there are some people that are predicting that they will even start going out next week. Merry Christmas. Okay, second thing, unemployment benefits. The two expiring CARES Act programs and the pandemic unemployment assistance, which make benefits available to self-employed or what are called gig economy workers, and also the pandemic emergency unemployment compensation, which provided additional weeks of benefits, were extended for an additional 11 weeks. Trying to, again, avert a fiscal crisis for millions of Americans. Then there's a section here for support for small businesses, and that would be what is called the Paycheck Protection Program, which has been available to small businesses. By the way, also Christian organizations have been part of that, for forgivable loans to keep them afloat and leave employees on the books. That was re-upped with $284 billion in funds. And then one on housing assistance. And the other day, Paul Barak has been on the program with us, sent me this piece on the mapping the risk of eviction and foreclosure in the United States. I don't know how I'd missed this, but it is fascinating because which state has the highest percentage of people and the highest number of people that will be foreclosed on and evicted? Texas. Now, part of that is population. Texas is larger than many of the other states. There are more people in Texas than some of the other states, New York, Florida, whatever. There are actually more people in California, but the eviction rates are higher in Texas than anywhere else. And so if you dig into the data a little bit, you find that the highest area of the country with evictions would be Houston, the Woodlands, and Sugar Land, where 47% of those individuals in those areas actually face potential eviction or foreclosure. Then you scan down, and then fifth on the list is the Dallas-Fort Worth area, adding in Arlington as well. So it's the whole metroplex, if you will, and that's 32%. So anyway, you know, number one is Houston, then second Miami, then third Atlanta, number four Chicago, number five Dallas, number six Seattle, number seven Detroit, number eight New York, New Jersey, number nine San Francisco, Oakland, Berkeley, number 10 Phoenix. So this will at least be very helpful for many of our Texas listeners. You may be one of those, because the bill extends the eviction moratorium, which is set to expire at the end of the year, which is days from now, through now the end of January. So it adds one more month. It also includes about $25 billion for rental assistance to families facing eviction. When we get into the issue of education, the bill includes several provisions relating to elementary, secondary, and higher education, provides about $82 billion for funds there so they can reopen the classrooms. And then nutritional assistance, the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program called SNAP, that's the old food stamps, directly adds another about $13 billion there. And then for those of you in the transportation industry, about $45 billion for transportation. That's $16 billion to support the airlines, airline employees, and contractors. About $14 billion for transit systems, $10 billion for highways, and a number of other things that are there as well. So it is a Christmas tree. It is loaded with lots of very expensive ornaments, and it will be passed today, at the latest tomorrow. And maybe some of those stimulus checks will show up in the mail. That has been something that has been discussed for months. It's very clear that Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, did not want to have any consideration of this until after the election, for fear that passing this might help Donald Trump. And so here we are, almost Christmas, finally getting a relief bill that people have been talking about for months. We'll be back and talk about some other aspects of this right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This is Christmas week, and I thought it might be worthwhile to spend a moment to reflect on the words of the hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem. It was written in 1867 by Philip Brooks, an Episcopal pastor from Philadelphia. He was in Israel 2 years earlier and had celebrated Christmas in Bethlehem, and he wrote this song to reflect on what that night of the birth of Jesus might be like. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by. Yet in the dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. You know, while the streets of our cities are quiet on Christmas Day, most likely that day was just like any other day for the people in Bethlehem. But as evening came, the town grew quiet, and something remarkable took place. In the second verse, the hymn says, While mortals sleep, the angels keep their watch of wondering love. Just like today, our world goes about its business, usually oblivious to the spiritual realities around it. Jesus came into the world quietly. Yes, there was the angelic announcement to the shepherds, but most other people were unaware of the fact that the most significant event in history was taking place. God became man. But he was born in a stable and laid in a feeding trough. There was no pomp or circumstance as you might expect of a king. Jesus came not only to live among us, but to ultimately die for our sins. He took upon himself the sins of the world, your sins and my sins, and paid the ultimate penalty that we deserve to pay that we might have everlasting life. During this Christmas week, I hope you'll stop long enough to consider what happened in that little town of Bethlehem. But even more so, I hope you will think about what Jesus did for you on Calvary. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, been talking about the coronavirus, so let's talk about the vaccine for just a minute. As we suspected, when there were the first individuals being injected with the Pfizer vaccine, and now, of course, they're rolling out the Moderna vaccine because now both of those have been actually approved by the Food and Drug Administration. We already saw that some individuals had an allergic reaction in the UK, and the warning went out that if you tend to be allergic to certain things, and since, of course, some people are allergic to, say, eggs, and so that might be the case. There's, of course, a big religious liberty issue right now because are the vaccines halal? For example, if you're Muslim, sometimes they use some kind of gel that might have pork in it. So that's been another question, but that's off target. But what it is that we are now seeing, not only in the UK, but interestingly enough in Alaska. What is it about Alaska? I don't even have my Alaska listeners right now on, but something's going on up there because most of the allergic reactions have been in Alaska, one other state. And so as a result, as you might imagine, the Food and Drug Administration is now investigating some of these allergic reactions to the Pfizer coronavirus vaccine that have been reported in at least 2 states, maybe more. I've lost track of where there might be some others. And so the director of the FDA Center for Biologics Evaluation, that would be Peter Marks, actually told reporters that the reactions had been reported in one state besides Alaska back then. They're actually now probing the 5 allergic reactions that they have seen. This, of course, is written from Saturday, It is now Monday, so it's possible they've picked up a few others. But anyway, he said, quote, we're working hand in hand with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and we're actually been working closely with our United Kingdom colleagues, who, of course, reported the allergic reaction there. I think we'll be looking at all the data we can from each of these reactions to sort out exactly what happened, and we'll also be looking to try to understand which component of the vaccine might be helping to produce them. And so kind of digging through this, and as we shared on Friday, and if you didn't have a chance to listen on Friday, we had Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, and we pointed out some things. Obviously, this has been the fastest turnaround in a vaccine probably in history. Has it been rushed too quickly? Maybe. I hope not. There's pretty good evidence that it's working and that it really will change our lives for the better. But you know what? We don't know what we don't know, because you do a test on, let's say in round numbers, I'll just round them off so that you can get my point. You do a test on 30,000 people, and then you roll it out to 300 million people. You can see that you're going to pick up some things, and so, of course, that's one of the issues. And, of course, allergic reactions to a vaccine, that's nothing new. But nevertheless, you're going to probably see quite a bit surfacing the next couple of days, and we'll try to do as best we can kind of a fact check here of individuals. Of course, the one that's making the rounds, if you haven't seen it by now, it's worth just checking out, because you have this nurse who had been actually vaccinated. I watched the longer one first, because now the one they just show is where she gets about 3 words out and then starts fading, and then it actually faints. And she said she tends to faint when she feels pain. And so it could be simply as simple as that. But nevertheless, you're going to have some people reporting those stories. And it will be interesting, because the press loves to report those kinds of stories generally. It's the old, if it bleeds, it leads. A car crash is much more interesting than a meeting that is in the city council, even though a decision by the city council will affect many more viewers than a car crash. But nevertheless, that's one side. The other side is Tucker Carlson's been pointing out that there's been such a push to try to downplay any of this, to force everybody to get a vaccine. We want to be honest, and we'll try to be here as well. So that's why I have this article. You can find it in the Hill, and it's the investigation of the allergic reaction. The one that is still hard for me to believe is I heard the other day of a couple of doctors that were suggesting that because people that are minorities, Hispanic American, African American, they usually don't mention in that same breath, for example, people from India, Asian Americans, whatever, but that are in some cases dealing with additional health challenges, maybe comorbidities. You now have a number of states that have actually said they're going to prioritize the Black, Hispanic, and indigenous residents over the white people. And when I first heard that, I said, nah, that's got to be fake news. Nobody would dare say that in public. Well, here you got the Daily Mail, and actually what turns out that, was it 25 states, as best as we can determine now, so we got 50 states, so half of them, are committed to a focus, I'm reading from this article, on racial and ethnic communities as they decide which groups should be prioritized in receiving the coronavirus vaccine dose. Some states have made even more specific plans, says the article, to prioritize communities of color, with 12 states, so that'd be 12 of the 25, by the way, specifically mentioning efforts to partner with healthcare providers in areas with large minority populations to reach diverse populations. Now, you could say part of that is necessary because if you heard me, at least on the last couple of days, point out, trying to get the vaccine to some of these individuals that are identifiable minorities is very difficult. To use the two extremes, the survey that I looked at just the other day said that 72% of Asian Americans would take the vaccine. No surprise there. I mean, they're the ones most likely to put a mask on even before everybody else put masks on. Now everybody has a mask on. And if you ever travel to an Asian country, oh my goodness, everybody's got a mask on. And they will have masks on the airplanes and all the rest. Now that's sort of changed. I think we're all wearing masks now. But anyway, that's 72%. Let's go to the other extreme, and I think it was like 32% of African Americans. Little bit higher for Hispanic Americans, much higher for Anglo Americans. And so the bottom line is you could honestly understand why some of this would be the case. And then certain states have really, because they tend to be more blue states, really focus on trying to get it to various groups. And, that's California and it's New Jersey and a number of others that are focused on that. Also, New Mexico working really hard to get them to the Native American communities. And I've not necessarily seen the percentage for Native Americans, but it's probably in there. And then again, the argument is that right now we would have to say that if you look at morbidity factors, Black and Hispanic people are more than 3 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than whites, yet they are the least likely by percentage of individuals to take the vaccine. So you can see why there's a focus on the priorities. But I was really struck by the fact that we always sort of have this idea, well, we want to treat everybody equally. And the answer that came from one of the individuals before this came out was, well, since the elderly populations are disproportionately white, we're going to ignore them. And I thought, boy, that's pretty crass. But the various states have tried to figure out ways to say that in a way that doesn't sound quite as prejudiced. And so we'll see where that takes us. But the other question that people have been asking is, once you've been vaccinated, how would we know? Well, Andrew Yang, remember him? He ran for the presidency, said, is there any way for someone to easily show they've been vaccinated, like a barcode that they can download on their phone? There ought to be. And the reaction to that has been interesting, because Buzz Patterson said, yet we can't require IDs to vote. Interesting. So we need to get a barcode to show you've been vaccinated, but we can't have photo IDs for you to vote. Ron Schneider went a little bit further, said, thanks for your thoughtless question. Maybe there is a way to show it. Would a tattoo on your forehead work for you? How about a number on your forehead or on forearm, or a yellow star for dissenters? And then, Dave Rubin, who is a liberal but has said he's really just become kind of fed up with his fellow liberals, said, I like Andrew Yang. I've had him on the show. He's welcome back. I'd love to go shoot hoops with him. But he says this sort of centralized authoritarian control that Democrats want around every part of your life is why there are so few moderates left. Star on the jacket, maybe? And the list goes on of the number of people, including some of the Christians that said, well, I know, why don't we just have a mark on the forehead or the back of the right hand? It would be the mark of vaccination or the mark of the beast. But nevertheless, Andrew Yang, I think illustrates, again, when you're in the tech world, you just want to know what works, and you don't even think about the social, moral, even political implications of it. And the number of reactions to Andrew Yang's Twitter account illustrates only so well why probably he wasn't going to be the next president of the United States. Now, maybe Joe Biden will put him in the cabinet, so we'll see where that goes. But let's take a break. We got a lot more to cover, especially since some people are still convinced that the election's not over, and we need to have a few more court challenges, so we'll talk about that right after this.
We all love buy one, get one free, and I've got a deal like that to tell you about. But first, as you listen to the news, do you ever feel like you're living in a different world from some people? The expert on one channel says something totally opposite from the expert on another. Finding the truth usually takes being willing to challenge both sides. It requires discernment, inspired by commitment to God's word, and a willingness to do your own research. And that describes Kerby Anderson and the team here at Point of View Radio. We are reaching a lot of people in these days of lockdowns and restrictions, and your support reaches even more right now during our $100,000 matching challenge. You invest, and whatever you give is doubled up to $100,000. It's sort of like buy one, get one free. So please give today at pointofview.net/year-end or call 1-800-347-5151. Make a big difference. Pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's talk about the election. Yes, it is December 21st. Okay, it is Christmas week. We are still talking about the election because, after all, there is a report from Peter Navarro, and so we're going to talk about that. It's the first article we've posted on the website. To be fair, what we also want to do is help you understand the analysis that was done basically in Michigan, and this one comes from an organization that we've already quoted before, but at the same time, we've also posted this piece by Andrew McCarthy, a whopper of an election rigging claim. Now, the theme for what I'm going to talk about for the better part of this half hour is probably best summarized by a verse in the Old Testament. It's Proverbs 18, verse 17. And if you've never gone to Proverbs 18, verse 17, I suggest you pull out your phone or pull out a Bible and look at it because it makes a very compelling case. That is, the one who states the case seems compelling, seems right, until another comes and examines him. And the argument that I will make is we have lots of allegations. Those allegations, sometimes when actually given some level of scrutiny, turn out to not so be as compelling as they might. Others seem fairly compelling. And the biggest problem we have with all of this, as I pointed out just the other day, we have had well, I guess most people say about 60 different lawsuits. I've seen some numbers say 57. Well, you know, what's few lawsuits among friends here. And most of those have been set aside. Now, if you're an individual that is a never Trumper, you say that just proves that all these allegations are false. No, it just shows, as we pointed out the other day, that interestingly enough, most of those have been rejected on a procedural basis because they weren't going to change the vote, and that was it. Now, if you're an always Trumper, then you're going to say the fact that these cases were dismissed shows there was a greater conspiracy out there or something of that nature, or that these allegations themselves should be sufficient. After all, it just took one anonymous whistleblower to initiate an impeachment trial against the President of the United States. Now we have, again, the numbers vary, but let's say 200 to 300 if you will, whistleblowers who have filed affidavits, and that should be enough. No, because indeed, as you were to bring them perhaps into a court of law or into a testimony where you could have cross-examination, you might find that some of them are making statements far beyond the facts that they've actually perceived. So the point is, and this is something to remember, we obviously recognize innocent till proven guilty. The burden of proof is upon the individual bringing the charges, and just because you bring the charges doesn't mean that that's necessarily the case. I also recognize it's very unfair. You charge Donald Trump with something, well, that's enough. You charge Joe Biden with something, oh no, you got to prove it. So, I mean, I recognize that we don't exactly live in a level playing field, but nevertheless, let's give at least some of the work by Peter Navarro his due. That is our first article. It's a 36-page report alleging election fraud. And I'll just read from the article here that you can find in the Washington Examiner. The director of the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, Peter Navarro, published a lengthy report outlining several examples of voter irregularities that are more than sufficient to swing the outcome of the election in President Trump's favor. Also, while I'm heading down this dangerous path with all sorts of landmines about ready to blow up in my face, let me at least acknowledge that a voter irregularity isn't necessarily a fraud. Okay, so let's make that distinction at least at the outset here. The 36-page report assesses the fairness and integrity of the 2020 presidential election by examining 6 dimensions of alleged election irregularities among 6 key battleground states. I might just point out that if you go to the website, you'll see a chart for those of you looking online, and the chart is very helpful because it actually shows, first of all, along the top, the various states, and then along the, if you will, y-axis, the 6 different issues. So in some respects, you can then begin to see which ones show up in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And as a result, points out these irregularities that actually are suggestive of some things that weren't handled well. Some of those could suggest outright ballot fraud, others ballot mishandling, other contestable process fouls, equal protection clause violation, voting machine irregularities, and significant statistical anomalies. So, nevertheless, Peter Navarro, in the Trump administration, in the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, concludes, evidence used to conduct this assessment includes more than 50 lawsuits and judicial rulings, thousands of affidavits and declarations, testimony in a variety of state venues, published analysis by think tanks and legal centers, videos and photos, public comments, and extensive press coverage. And so that finally concludes then, here's the bottom line, the ballots in question, because of the identified election irregularities, are more than sufficient to swing the outcome in favor of President Trump, should even a relatively small portion of these ballots be ruled illegal. The bottom line is they're not ruled illegal, and there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, judges don't want to do this for all sorts of reasons. They don't want to do this because in some cases we're talking about irregularities that were brought about because a judge said, no, you don't have to check the signatures, or no, you can actually get the ballots coming in late. What judge in their right mind is going to say, well, then I'm going to rule those inappropriate when the people who actually voted actually did so based upon what they thought was legal at the time? You can't hold them responsible for voting according to the rules that maybe weren't actually implemented constitutionally, but they were following the best rules of the day. And the example I love to use is every once in a while you get somebody gets their car towed and it's in a no parking zone, and they have a very reasonable defense. There's no parking sign. There's no parking sign up. Well, it was taken down. Well, you can't hold a person responsible for parking in a no parking zone when there's not a sign that says no parking. Same kind of idea there. You can't say, I'm going to invalidate your vote when you followed the rules by your state, even if the state violated its own constitution. You see the point? And so that's part of it. Now, some of these are actual outright fraud, and I think that certainly outright fraud, which shows up in at least 4 of the 6 states, should be prosecuted. I think we should, if nothing else, go out of our way to prosecute as much voter fraud as possible. Number one, so it doesn't happen again, deterrence. And number two, so that we have verified examples so that we can end this nonsense that we hear time and time again from various political leaders and from various people in the media that there's no voter fraud when we know that there is. We've documented this on this program many times. Hans von Spakowski's been on here. Eric Eggers has been on here. John Fund has been on here. There are whole databases of voter fraud. But one of the quickest ways to end this silly comment that there's no voter fraud is to simply prosecute people who commit voter fraud. And, of course, as we pointed out, there was a fair amount of voter fraud during the Democratic primaries. You cannot tell me then there's not voter fraud, because sometimes they say, well, that's just something the Republicans use. It's a canard the Republicans come up with. No, Democrats were upset because other Democrats were engaged in fraud. And it was so bad in places like New Jersey, they actually had to redo the election. They had to do a mulligan. In other cases, like the congressional district, the 12th congressional district in New York, finally just had to have a judge come in and say, well, the incumbent wins, even though we were sure there's fraud, because we can't sort it all out. And so that's one of the issues. But when we come back from the break, though, what I want to do also is get to this whole analysis of the Dominion voting systems in Michigan. And it is true that we had a situation in Michigan in one particular area where you had some real problems in Antrim County. And as a result, that then started people doing an investigation of Dominion voting systems and a number of other particular groups. And so this was done by a group here in Dallas, Russell Ramsland, which is with an organization that has taken some time to evaluate through his team at Allied Security Operations Group what happened with those voting systems and those voting machines. And so those voting machines, people are alleging, were not counting correctly. Yet we seem to have paper records, number one. And if indeed these machines are so defective, you would think the Attorney General of the United States would want to get those machines and bring them in. And of course, the Attorney General the other day, Bill Barr, said, no, we're not going to impound those machines. But at the same time, why is it that Texas, on 3 separate occasions, when offered to maybe use the Dominion voting systems, rejected those? So I'm going to try to, if I can, thread the needle by talking about some of the concerns, but also recognize that, as Andrew McCarthy points out, some of those claims are real whoppers. We'll come back and talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me mention that the next hour we're going to spend some time talking about the book, How Long, O Lord, How Long? And really what it is kind of a devotional, but it gives me an opportunity to talk with the president of Thriving Through Transitions, which is an opportunity for individuals who are in the midst of transition. Nice way to say you probably got fired and you're trying to get another job. And so I really wanted to talk to him not only about the devotional book, but also just some of the issues that we are facing today day where you almost doubled the unemployment rate in America. And so what can we do to help people that are unemployed? And so I think this is something that we want to talk about both from an individual point of view, but I hope some of the churches listening will think about what they can do to reach out to those unemployed in their congregations and in their communities. So nevertheless, we'll get to that in a little bit. Rod Dreher will be with us. We'll talk about the Jericho March. We'll talk about Live Not by Lies, and we'll talk about this upcoming, if you will, protest January 6th when the Electoral College votes are to be ratified and certified in Congress, and whether or not that will lead to a floor fight, which a lot of Republicans want to avoid, but who knows where we're going to go. Again, remember, Proverbs 18, verse 17, because, again, you can state the case, but then another comes along and examines it. And the case was stated when we began to see what happened in Antrim County in Michigan, where it was very obvious that this is a county that always would vote for Donald Trump and would be expected to have been one that he would win. And when Joe Biden won, a lot of people said there must be something wrong, and so they went in and found that maybe there was a problem with the voting machine, the way it was set up. So this has led to, of course, the analysis that came by an individual who actually is been an individual, by the way, we happen to know, Russell Ramsden, who lives in Dallas. And he and his team at Allied Security Operations looked at the machines, and they argued that the original report had log evidence that we published in the report showing exactly what did and exactly the findings. They found that the complaint is, well, there's no proof, but the argument is that they found that if nothing else, that they concluded that the voting system itself is intentionally and purposefully designed with inherent errors to create systematic fraud and influence election results. And so this particular piece came out, and we've talked about it before. And so you might say, well, then that's pretty much, smoking gun, silver bullet kind of evidence, until you go to the second article we've posted by Andrew McCarthy. Now, Andrew McCarthy is a lawyer who, of course, as we've talked about before, is one of those individuals that brought a prosecution against the terrorists trying to destroy, in the first attempt, the World Trade Center. He is, of course, now with the National Review Institute, which is a conservative institute. He's one of the fellows and a contributing author. And nevertheless points out that when you look at that error in Antrim County, he says it was a good faith error. It was inevitably corrected, and there are paper receipts for all votes. Even if the machine tabulation was thrown off by a formatting problem, the paper doesn't lie, and there are multiple layers of bipartisan review, which is one of the reasons why I've said before, any voting machine also should create a paper record. I'm a precinct chairman in Collin County, and I can tell you that we can, in a variety of different ways, check to make sure the vote totals work. We may not know how a person voted, but we know how many people did vote, and if those numbers don't add up, we've got a problem. And so the other day, I pointed out that Russell Ramsden pointed out that there was a 68% error rate. But at the time, I did try to point out that that was actually a tabulation rate error, not an actual count error. And that is something that Christopher Krebs, might remember him, he was the head of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Well, he was. And then Donald Trump fired him. Remember him? Okay, and he actually explained in a Senate testimony that that's what that was. And, of course, even as we post this material last week, I pointed out that Mike Huckabee, a former governor of Arkansas and also presidential candidate, said, look, if there is a problem with what Russell Ramsden did, okay, well, let's have somebody else look at it and evaluate it as well. And so, if nothing else, that is kind of what is in this particular piece. And I've posted it so that you can see that when given a chance to look at the results, concluded in this 5-page summary, that some of the claims where they took what happened in one county in Michigan and extrapolated it to the entire country just doesn't pass the straight face test, does not necessarily work. Are there other errors with the system? Probably. Would that affect the election? Probably not. But again, you have these kind of conspiracy theories that grow up, and so I wanted you to, if nothing else, be able to hear a response to that and recognize that there's not a 68% error rate in the machines. There was, in that particular case, a 68% error rate in the tabulation, which is very different. In other words, it's actually an alert rate rather than an error rate, probably a better way to describe that. And so, again, when you hear people making these claims, you have to recognize that in some cases, they're actually just quoting the headlines. And frankly, many of the headlines were wrong because that's not even what Allied Security Systems was claiming in the first place. I could actually bring him in, I suspect, since I know at least one of us know who he is, but I think we've sort of set that one aside to show that even if the error took place in Michigan, it's not enough to change the election. But it is reason to have a question mark about whether or not you want to use those voting systems in the future. And congratulations to the state of Texas by simply saying no. Let me take on one more conspiracy theory, and then we're done with conspiracy theories for the day. And that is this one, is rumors are swirling right now about the parent company that produces ammunition. I did not know its name was Vista Outdoors. They produce ammunition for Federal, Remington, Spear, and CCI. By the way, disclaimer, I use a fair amount of that ammunition, both in a shotgun and other ones, and have had difficulty finding some of the ammunition in various stores, although I've been able to order certain parts of it online. But there have been arguments and conspiracy theories saying that they have ceased manufacturing the ammo and are now just picking and choosing who they're going to provide ammunition to. And so enough is enough. And so the president of Vista Outdoors Ammunition, Jason Vanderbrink, decided to actually speak out. And he said, I'm tired of all the hate mail. I'm tired of the people showing up at our factories. I'm tired of reading the misinformation on the internet right now about we're not trying to service the demand that we're experiencing. And, of course, by the way, have you noticed there's been a shortage of other things like, I don't know, toilet paper and machines and appliances? So it's not surprising there's a shortage of ammunition. But he makes a very simple calculation. And again, you know, maybe I'm not the greatest math expert. I did go to a government school, so check me out here. But he points out that we've had 7 million new shooters since March. If you just assume that each one of those shooters just gets 2 boxes of ammunition, 50 rounds in that, so it'd be 100, then you would have to produce an additional 700 million new rounds of ammunition. And so the demand is 700 million rounds of ammunition higher, and the supply is shrinking because the number of people going to the factories is half of what it was before. So if you have an increase in demand and a decrease in supply, am my math right here? I think so. Then that's called a shortage. It's not a conspiracy. You just have a lot more people that have purchased guns and want ammunition at a time when we are producing less because we have fewer people working in the factories. Anyway, end of that conspiracy, I hope. Anyway, let's take a break. We're going to get into some other issues, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
I am tired. 2020 has been a hard year for most of us, and the reality is that 2021 will arrive with its own set of uncertainties. About the only thing that we know for sure is that seeing every issue, every challenge through biblically trained eyes will be sorely needed. And that is what you provide to people all across this nation and right here at home as you support Point of View Radio. People are tuning in. They're listening for longer times than before. It reveals that we're all desperate for fresh, rational, reliable, honest, hope-filled perspectives. And that's what you find on Point of View. Without you, that doesn't happen. But with you, hope will flow, and doubly so right now. Every dollar you give right now will be matched up to $100,000. Please give today at pointofview.net/year-end or call 1-800-347-5151. Keep fighting with us. Give today. pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. It is our Christmas week, and looking forward to a number of live broadcasts. Later in the week, obviously, as we get to Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, we'll be playing tapes, but right now we're live, and if you'd like to join us at any point, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Going to be talking in just a minute about how to maybe minister to and help individuals that have lost their job, because that is becoming a big issue. In any particular year, about 21 million people become unemployed due to layoffs or job eliminations and others, but that number almost doubled during the pandemic, so we're going to be talking about that in just a minute. But let me just mention real quickly some issues in the news, and that is that it looks like the $900 billion coronavirus relief bill will be passed. This will be a little different. Stimulus checks will be going out, in this case, $600 per adult or child. Those of you that are adults might have gotten a check for $1,200. This time it's $600. But the child would have gotten $500, this time gets $600. It also provides unemployment benefits, something we'll be talking about in just a minute, to deal with some of the expiring CARES Act programs dealing with unemployment. Support for small business, especially one on housing. Interestingly enough, I've been researching the number of people that are facing foreclosures or eviction. That will be extended now to the end of January and will not actually end at the end of December. And then a whole sorts of other things for education, transportation, nutritional assistance, and the like. We'll probably talk more about that later in the week, especially as it passes, but I wanted you to know that that is one of the issues we've been following. Also, of course, as the vaccine is rolled out, there have been some allergic reactions. Some of the more significant ones have taken place in the state of Alaska, and we have Alaska visitors and listeners up there as well. So the FDA Center for Biologics and Evaluation will be looking at some of those reasons for the allergic reaction, and so we'll be following that certainly this week as well. And I've posted a couple of articles having to do with the Peter Navarro report on election fraud, also one questioning the analysis that was done that we reported last week on the Dominion system of voting. Maybe we'll get into that the next hour, because Rod Dreher will be with us. We'll be talking about not only his book, Live Not by Lies, which we talked with him about in October, but also one of the articles we posted, what I saw at the Jericho March, and some of the concerns he has about the reaction to how some individuals maybe are making some claims far beyond the data in terms of election irregularities. So we'll be maybe talking about that in the next hour. But as I mentioned, when you talk about unemployment, it's a topic we don't address very often, and I thought this hour would be good to address it if you're an individual who has been unemployed for some time, or you know someone who does, but also know that there are quite a number of you that are church leaders and pastors and deacons and elders. Maybe you can think about what you can do to reach out to members not only of your church, but people in your community. So that's why I thought you would want to know about this book, which is really a set of devotions for the unemployed and for those who love them, and also to know more about this organization called Thriving Through Transitions. Dale Kreienkamp is the president of that organization and has been involved in this for some time. Matter of fact, worked more than 40 years as a human resource executive and consultant, a coach, and really an individual that I thought you would want to hear more about, not only in terms of the book, which we have on the website, but also his organization. So, if nothing else, Dale, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, Kerby, thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to our conversation.
I would love to not only talk about your experience in human resources, but your own personal experience, because that, I think, is kind of significant as well. I mean, in some respects, your story is the reason for this devotional that has just so many really thoughtful kinds of things to address this issue of anger and panic and depression and despair, eventually moving towards considering new opportunities and a greater opportunity for learning. But share a little bit of your story, because we have some time to not only get to know you, but to spend some time digging through the book.
Kerby, thanks. I would say that my story as it relates to the book really started in 2003. At that time, I was a senior executive in a hospital. We had about 4,000 employees, 1,000 on the medical staff, another 800 or 900 volunteers, and we had worked with our new chief operating officer on a reorganization plan because we had some cost issues. And the following Monday, 25 leaders were going to lose their job. Now, I'd grown up in the organization. I'd been there for 25 years, so my children were born while I worked there. I went to graduate school there. That had been a big part of my life. And as I was sitting there having a conversation with the chief operating officer, I was updating him about what our plans were. How are we going to prepare leaders to have those conversations with the 25 people that were impacted? How do we tell somebody, thanks for the memories, you didn't do anything wrong, but we need to eliminate your position? How do we support those 25 people that were hearing that news? And then how do we help an organization? And it was interesting, at the end of the conversation, he got up and he stood behind his chair and he paused, which, reflecting later, seemed a little bit odd. And he looked at me and he said, "Your name is on the list." With those 6 little words, I became unemployed for the first time in my life. And that was then not an easy journey, as many people who've gone through unemployment have gone through. It's a difficult one. And as I went through that journey, I looked for some resources that I didn't find there, and I always thought something needs to be done. But after many months of searching, went into consulting, did that for 5 years. At the end of that, one of my clients hired me away, and I did that for 10 years. And at the end of that 10 years, I had a similar conversation to the first one. My position was again eliminated. And it was at that point in time that I said, all right, it's time to give back. And that's when we went and we created the book, How Long, O Lord, How Long? Devotions for the Unemployed and Those Who Love Them. So that's kind of how we got there.
And each one of them is quite readable, and we're going to talk about some of the aspects of that because, you know, I can't believe this happened to me. What will my family think? Or later on, I don't deserve that. And then you start, you know, getting in some things, well, don't constrain God, and how to kind of think about that kind of from a biblical point of view, and try to use your time well, and to maybe get into what are the strengths and weaknesses you might have. And you really kind of take us through the roller coaster, because it really is an incredible kind of roller coaster where you start out with shock and denial, then anger and blame and despair, and eventually get to the point of acceptance and learning. And so we're going to spend some time kind of talking through that, but also it is a great resource. And if you find yourself saying you'd like to know a little bit more, of course, as we always do, we have a link to where you can get the book, but also have a link to Dale's website. And you might say, okay, I don't know how to spell his last name. Good news is it's already on the website there. So it's DaleKreienkamp.com, and we have that on the website so you can get a copy of the book. But most importantly, I'm hoping that some of you, even if you're not unemployed, you know somebody that has been, somebody that is, and some of you in church leadership might begin to think about what you can do to reach out to not only church members, but people in your community. What a great opportunity for ministry. That's why we're doing it today. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This is Christmas week, and I thought it might be worthwhile to spend a moment to reflect on the words of the hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem. It was written in 1867 by Philip Brooks, an Episcopal pastor from Philadelphia. He was in Israel 2 years earlier and had celebrated Christmas in Bethlehem, and he wrote this song to reflect on what that night of the birth of Jesus might be like. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by. Yet in the dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. You know, while the streets of our cities are quiet on Christmas Day, most likely that day was just like any other day for the people in Bethlehem. But as evening came, the town grew quiet, and something remarkable took place. In the second verse, the hymn says, while mortals sleep, the angels keep their watch of wondering love. Just like today, our world goes about its business, usually oblivious to the spiritual realities around it. Jesus came into the world quietly. Yes, there was the angelic announcement to the shepherds, but most other people were unaware of the fact that the most significant event in history was taking place. God became man. But he was born in a stable and laid in a feeding trough. There was no pomp or circumstance as you might expect of a king. Jesus came not only to live among us, but to ultimately die for our sins. He took upon himself the sins of the world, your sins and my sins, and paid the ultimate penalty that we deserve to pay that we might have everlasting life. During this Christmas week, I hope you'll stop long enough to consider what happened in that little town of Bethlehem. But even more so, I hope you will think about what Jesus did for you on Calvary. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. A little bit later, we'll take some phone calls, and perhaps you want to share your own journey or experience. And if nothing else, Dale Kreienkamp is an individual that is a fellow traveler. As you've just heard, he's been through this as well. So not only has he been on the side of coaching and helping and encouraging, he's also been on the side of those who one day found out you're on the list. Let's, if we can, maybe talk about that initial shock, because one of your devotionals, I love it. I can't believe this happened to me. And the instantaneous flood of emotions, you know, I'm angry. Why does this happen? Why not someone else? What am I going to tell my kids? What am I going to tell my spouse? What will others think? And you take us right away to some scripture verses. Psalm 50, verse 15. Call on me in the day of trouble. I will deliver you, and you will honor me. Or another one in Deuteronomy, or you can also see this in Joshua, be strong and courageous. And so it seems to me that when this happens to you or to somebody that you are in contact with, friend, neighbor, coworker, family member, some of those key verses are going to be helpful, because that initial shock is, in most cases, shock. You didn't see it coming. And as you shared in your own experience, at the very end, you find out, oh, I'm on the list. I didn't know that I was even on the list. I probably would have said things a little bit differently if I'd known that I was. So help us out, because denial is one of the first things you talk about in the book.
Yeah, it really is. And the interesting part, Kerby, is when someone gets that news, sometimes we have this inkling something might not be right, or we might think, well, sure, it could happen. There's still just that shocked that it actually did happen. And it's no different than shock that happens at an unexpected loss of a loved one from a death or something else. It's just kind of hard to process. And we tend to then start going through all those emotions that come from us, especially anger is a big one that comes to us. There's anger at the person who did this, the person who gave the message to you. And what I wanted to help readers know is God gives us a variety of promises, and one of those is always going to be with us. He's never going to forsake us. So as we go through this difficult journey, as we go through, and you aptly described it, it is the roller coaster of emotions that we deal with unemployment, that he's with us right there. It doesn't make everything go away instantly just because I read Scripture, but it's in being in Scripture that we are strengthened and able to deal with what we're having thrust upon us.
One of the questions that goes through your mind is, what will my family think? And then in just a minute, I want to talk about time to tell the world. But that's a big one because in some respects, in this day and age, maybe some families can say, well, we're a dual income family, so, everybody's going to lose a job, but we've got backup. But if you're the sole breadwinner, or you're a single mom, or whatever that circumstance is, that's devastating. And to come back and tell your spouse, if you're married, to come back and tell your kids, if you're a single mom or single dad, that's a tough one, isn't it?
It really is. In fact, Kerby, I've met people who have really actually denied and pushed that off. I've talked to people who have made like they were going to work for a number of days before they could bring to actually have that conversation with family and let them know what happens. It's also hard to have that conversation with your kids because you wonder, what are they thinking about this? Older kids certainly are able to realize a little bit more how significant this is. Younger kids might just wonder, well, what does this mean for us, and worry about it. So it is a difficult one. What I think is important, though, is to have those conversations and be really honest about what's going on, what happened, what this means for us. And for younger children especially, to alleviate their fears. Even though we might have some serious concerns, how do I calm the fears? Because when we don't know, when nobody talks about it, we imagine the worst. We imagine things far worse than they really are. And so have those conversations, bring the family into it. You need people with you on that journey, and it starts with a good conversation.
Let's see if we can talk about the other part of that. And again, you pointed out, I was going to maybe get to that I know of stories of individuals that just get up and dress, go to work, briefcase in hand, sit in a Starbucks all day, and then come home and don't tell their family for sometimes, you said days. I haven't heard some stories of people for weeks. But what about this, what you tell other people? Now, I understand that some people, and I think you even said you were on, quote, sabbatical. And so in some respects, or sometimes they'll say, well, I'm just taking a time out here to reassess my priorities. It's just tough to go and tell somebody, I just got laid off.
It really is. It is. I tell people often that it is the feeling that you had, maybe if you were in high school and you got cut from the baseball team like I did. It's just that feeling of being rejected, and you don't want to go talk to people about it. I was blessed. I was cut in the days before social media. I guarantee you I didn't get on the phone and call everybody. But it becomes an important thing that we do tell the world what's going on. And my first time I was unemployed, I was not as good about telling people. I thought I was good, but I kept running into people that I knew well who would say, Dale, I didn't know that you were looking for a job. I wish I would have known. We had a perfect opportunity at my company, or I knew of a perfect opportunity. And because they didn't know, they couldn't get in touch with me.
There you go. Yeah.
And people, if they don't know, they can't help. So our own personal pride gets in the way. But we need to go the opposite of that, and we need to tell the world that we're in search mode. Help the world know what we're looking for, and that means everybody, former coworkers, friends, family members, let them know, because people can't help if they don't know. We've got to start and we've got to go the opposite way. And so one of the things that I've done in the book, in the back there are some appendixes. I put an example of what I used when I left my last employer, how I told the world, because sometimes people need an example. I don't know what to write. It just gives you one idea to help get you started on the way. But it's extremely important to let people know.
Let's talk about the appendices for just a minute since we jumped there, because I was very impressed with that. I'm always one to talk about let's get as much shoe leather there. Let's get as much practical advice and information, because sometimes people talk in generalities, and that's not as helpful. And you've got an appendix that certainly deals with some of the topics and books that you can read, and that was worthwhile there. You also, of course, have, we've already alluded to the change curve, but then you have sample communications and then even preparing for an interview. So if somebody's saying, I don't really know what I'm going to say if I go into the next interview, what do I tell them about my previous job and all the rest? And so you've got all sorts of books and resources and categories. So it's really well done there. But just before we take a break, let's get into one other issue. It's the theological background to all of this. How could God let this happen? I mean, sometimes we're angry at the employer. Sometimes we're angry at God, or maybe we're just confused. God, I thought this was the job you wanted me in. This was part of my calling. And now I've walked in through that open door that I thought you provided for me. And now I'm having to walk right back out that door. So what about that? How do we think that through?
Well, I think when people have that happen, it's pretty natural to wonder the things you just talked about. Wait a second, this wasn't how I planned it. And yet God says in Scripture, my plans are not your plans, my ways are not your ways. And this job loss isn't necessarily God punishing you or doing something to you. We live in a sinful world. And in that sinful world, things happen. But God doesn't leave us. God stays with us. All things work together for those that know him and love him. And so it's an opportunity then for us to say, how do I go from here forward? How do I get past the hurt is going to be the first part, which is extremely difficult for people. But then how do I move forward to see what other plans God might have? How might he use me in ways that maybe I hadn't even begun to imagine?
Let's take a break. And again, if you are interested in the book, 80 different devotions, each with scripture to provide kind of help and healing and hope and direction and all the rest. When we come back, we'll talk about, maybe doing a reassessment, your gifts, how to order your time, how to kind of take the next steps. And by the way, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to know a little bit more, we have a link, obviously, to DaleKreienkamp.com. And you don't have to know how to spell a name because it's right there at pointofview.net. Of course, we have information about this. It's both in paperback and Kindle, and you may know somebody that needs to get a copy of this book. Maybe you should think about giving them a book like this for Christmas or to get off to the start of the new year. So we wanted you to know about this, and most importantly, I want some of you in churches to think about what you might do to help the tens of millions unemployed. What can we do? We'll be right back.
We all love buy one, get one free, and I've got a deal like that to tell you about. But first, as you listen to the news, do you ever feel like you're living in a different world from some people? The expert on one channel says something totally opposite from the expert on another. Finding the truth usually takes being willing to challenge both sides. It requires discernment, inspired by commitment to God's Word, and a willingness to do your own research. And that describes Kerby Anderson and the team here at Point of View Radio. We are reaching a lot of people in these days of lockdowns and restrictions, and your support reaches even more right now during our $100,000 matching challenge. You invest, and whatever you give is doubled up to $100,000. It's sort of like buy one, get one free. So please give today at pointofview.net/year-end or call 1-800-347-5151. Make a big difference. Pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You're listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue your conversation with Dale Kreienkamp, and if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Take some of those calls in just a minute. How Long, O Lord, How Long? Devotions for the Unemployed and Those Who Love Them. And it is a book that you probably can find in your local bookstore, but we've made it very easy for you to get a copy. We have a link to his website. We also have additional information there as well. And just before we take a phone call or two, Dale, let's, if we can, maybe talk about what you do when you find yourself in that situation. Everybody has either been unemployed because they were fired, because they were laid off, or maybe they just found themselves in a situation where they just wanted to leave one job and find another. And so what we're going to share now is really relevant to anyone in that circumstance, and that is to begin to make sure that, first of all, especially if you're unemployed, but even if you are employed, to do an assessment of your own gifts, your abilities, and to make sure that you have a schedule. I mean, there might be a tendency after maybe a little bit of discouragement to say, I'm just going to sit home, watch television, hope the phone rings. That's not going to work. So kind of how do you order your days when you find yourself all of a sudden unemployed, or even maybe for some of our listeners who say, I really want to find a better job than the one I've got right now? What would you suggest for them?
Kerby, I start with the assessment. That becomes the most important, is we stop and say, where are my gifts? Not what job duties have I been doing, not what am I comfortable at, but what are the gifts, the things that I do really well, the things that give me joy? And many of us are good at multiple things. I tell people all the time, I know how to make an Excel spreadsheet work really well, but it does not give me joy. It sucks the life out of me. So stopping and taking a moment to say, what do I do? What do I do well? I think the challenge for people that are unemployed, we want to so quickly become employed. We just want to do what we were doing before somewhere else. And yet maybe this is the time for a stop. And when you reevaluate, that it's time to change industries. It's time to change the type of work that you do. Maybe it's time to go into business yourself. And you won't know until you spend some time, which when you're unemployed, you have. If I'm someone who's currently working, those things become a little bit harder because maybe you don't have as much time because you're doing the work, but it's equally important to have that analysis.
Yes.
Ask yourself, what gives me joy in this work that I do? What's easy for me? What could I see myself doing in the future? And then begin your strategy to look for the next job that meets those things. So be less concerned about the job as finding the right job. Otherwise, you might go through this whole process again in a shorter period of time than you'd like.
Very good. Just a minute, I want to talk about what we can do to maybe be an encouragement to people in the midst of this transition. But let's take some phone calls. We'll head to Missouri, KTTK. Colin, you're on with Dale Kreienkamp.
Yes, I wanted to state I was in construction. Sometimes I'd lose 13 jobs in 1 year. You're working your way out of a job the day you get there, and you got to learn to bounce. And employment is a revolving door. It's just another opportunity to get a better job. How to take it, receive it in your mind. How to accept unemployment, and losing a job is just an opportunity to get a better one. Failure is just a matter of opinion. You didn't fail.
That's very good. And I think Colin brings up a good point. Some of our listeners are in professions where job transition is pretty regular. He was mentioning construction. There are some that if they don't get fired, they're going to leave anyway, because I've heard that especially in the software fields and things like that, sometimes you want to move from one to the other because you want to develop other kinds of computer skills. So, and especially since our younger generation, we do a millennial roundtable, they actually expect that they're probably going to change jobs frequently, maybe even change careers a couple of times before they live. leave the world. And it does seem to me that it's a very different kind of world than you work for General Motors and then General Motors will take care of you and you get your gold watch after 30, 40 years working for one company. So in some respects, you have to almost expect job transitions, don't you?
Absolutely. And our young people today, candidly, they've learned watching what happened to mom and dad. They watched mom and dad work for many years for a company and then all of a sudden lose the job. I think they have a much different approach. It's probably a better approach as they come in, knowing that there will be changes. And with that, and I love what Cullen said about opportunity, there's a new opportunity to learn a skill I didn't have, to grow in an industry that I don't have any experience. There is opportunity out there. We tend to focus on the loss. It's important to try and focus on the opportunity as we move forward.
Well, before I take another phone call, real quickly, one of the things we might talk about is what can friends or family or maybe even churches do to support someone going through a job transition? You have a couple of ideas in your book about that.
Let's start with friends and family and helping. The most important thing is be connected to that person who's unemployed. Be proactive. I have a good friend, Bill. He was one of many who operated in the same way. They reached out to say, how can I help you? Who can I introduce you to? What can I do? Let's get together for lunch. We need to be proactive. If the person that you know who's unemployed is married, check with their spouse. Spouses rarely get asked how they're doing, but they're on the same journey. So instead of just saying, how is the person that you know is unemployed, ask that spouse how they're doing. Be an encourager. This is a long, tough journey often. We don't know when it's going to end. We don't control much in this process. We control our efforts, but we don't control the results. So continued encouragement is going to be important to build them up. And the most important thing friends and family can do is introduce them to different people.
Mm-hmm.
If you're unemployed, you need to meet more people. And you can do it the easy way, which would be, I would say, send an email to my friend Kerby and just mention my name. That doesn't necessarily work really well. But if I reached out and said, Kerby, would you meet with this friend of mine who's unemployed? And you said yes, then I connect them. It helps. So connecting them with people is extremely important.
Let's take some more phone calls. We'll head up to Maine this time. Kay, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I just wanted to call in and encourage anybody who's unemployed right now, and just to say that you're very much needed in America right now. As if you're, well, it doesn't matter if you do coding for computers or sewing or any of that. The products that Americans need are things like USA, American-made products like jackets and clothes and blankets and even computer platforms where you won't get kicked off if you say the wrong thing. That such a wonderful opportunity exists right now for people just to do startup businesses and get the word out. And if the American public, when you see American made 100% in America, back those businesses and spend your money on those people who are trying to do this so that we can become strong again and independent in our production of the goods that the Americans need. Because everything, if you look in the stores, you'll find labels from everywhere in the world, but you don't see American-made products, and we need that right now. Doesn't matter if it's hats, gloves, underwear, shirts, just anything, rakes, whatever you can think of, and start supporting people who do that and buy their products. So I just want to say that to anybody out there who's listening, who's out of a job right now, you're very much needed, and we need this very much.
What a great suggestion. First of all, of course, it gets us back to the fact that we're a nation of entrepreneurs, and so there's some great opportunities, especially with the Internet. It used to be that you'd open up a store. Let's say Kay's up there in Maine. Oh, okay, how many people are going to be going past that store? But you get on the Internet, and you're manufacturing things, and you can get an Etsy site, or you can get a Facebook post, or you can do all sorts of things. You can sell things on eBay. I mean, there's just so many more opportunities opportunities that exist. And again, I certainly agree with her idea of Buy American. We've done programs in the past where we've talked about you go into certain hardware stores and you try to find a hammer made by an American. It used to be I would, when we'd have our round table with a number of guests, I could say, everybody take off their shoes. Anybody here have a pair of shoes made in the United States? And everybody said, no, I don't. And so, again, just some great points there, but we need to take a break. And if you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to know a little bit more. I'm unemployed. I know somebody's unemployed, or I'm just maybe trying to figure out what the future is for me as we head into this new year. That's why I wanted to do this interview today. For those of you in church leadership, come on, I think it's about time we should reach out to the unemployed out there. More than 20 million people every year are unemployed because of layoffs or discharges or job eliminations or whatever. And that number has almost doubled during the pandemic. Yes, we are seeing a snapback, but there's still a lot more that we can be doing. So if you find yourself wanting to know more about this book, or you'd like to contact Dale Kreienkamp, we have that link on our website, and we'll continue our conversation right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dale Kreienkamp with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, How Long, O Lord, How Long? Devotions for the Unemployed and Those Who Love Them. If you'd like to find out a little bit more about him, we have a link to the website. You can get a copy of the book. And I thought just in the few hours, or actually minutes now that we have remaining, and in the next hour we'll get into another topic, but in the few minutes left, I thought we might get into some of the other feelings of frustration. For example, you have a devotional on I miss working, or I feel forgotten. I'm at the bottom of the pit and I want to give up. I don't have enough energy. Can you address those issues? Because that's a very significant part of your book, and one of the reasons when we talk about the fact that once you go from shock and denial and anger and blame and anxiety, eventually you're kind of at the bottom of the pit. How do you get out from that lull and go back up on the roller coaster up to something that looks like embracing the opportunity and even considering and learning new opportunities? How do we get ourselves out of that funk that almost is inevitable?
Well, let's start, Kirby, with just the concept of emotions. The book is really more about the emotions we go through when we're unemployed than it is the tactical, how do I write a resume? How do I do a job search? Because it's the emotions that surprise people. They don't expect that. They think this is a task. I'm going to go find a job. And when they're not successful or when they're struggling, that's when all the emotions come. And when we go to the bottom of the pit, the way out is to finally give it over to God and to let Him have it. Whether it be the anger at someone that you just can't get past, the person who said your name is on the list, or whether it is just the frustration that nothing is moving forward, we've got to give it over to God. And I always tell people there's a couple ways that you can do it that often work. One of those would be just close the door, let it all out. Scream, holler, the top of your lungs, whatever it is, or journal the thoughts that are going through your mind. Get out what you can't get past. Talk to a friend or a Christian counselor. And when we finally can let go of the burden, then we're ready to move forward. It's really hard to run forward when you're looking backwards, and so we've got to get past it. And so to get out of the bottom of the pit, give it to God is one. The second thing I'll say is take some time during this unemployment journey to do things for other people, because the job search is all about you. When you can do things for other people, you're going to feel better about yourself, maybe a chance to use your skills, and it's going to help you move forward.
Very good. Help us with schedule, because middle part of your book gets into that, and I sort of skipped over it, but that's another way to get you out of that. You have, for example, this idea of focus days, flex days, days off, because in some respects you can either work real hard and wear yourself out, or you can, like I said, prop yourself in front of the TV set and give up. So it does seem to me that having some kind of schedule that doesn't require that you work on it every day, but also keeps you somewhat accountable. Talk about the schedule, because that's something that is a very key part of your book as well, isn't it?
It is. And a good friend of mine helped me with that. When you lose a job, you immediately say, I'm going to work as many hours as I was working in my job to find a new job. And that sounds great in theory, but sometimes it's hard to do. And we become conflicted because there are things that we want to do, but we feel we need to be looking for a job. So in my book, I talk about 3 different types of days. A focus day is totally going to be focused on the job search, setting appointments, reaching out to people, research. Anything I can is a focus on the job search. The second type of day is a flex day, which says I'm going to be working on the job search, but if something comes up, I give myself permission to step aside and do that. I love golf. So if it's in the summer and someone calls and said, hey, can you play golf Wednesday afternoon? If that's a flex day, then I give myself permission to say, okay, I'll do that and enjoy that time. And the other is to make sure that we take days off, because you can spend constant time in the job search. And it's in giving ourselves permission. So the structure really is about permission giving to ourselves to help us as we structure ourselves.
Just before we go, let's talk about some of the things on your website. First of all, you have, of course, a store which allows people to get a copy of the book, but I've been talking about the fact that some might want to do a group study, and you actually have a group study for people. You also are available for speaking in case people wanted to contact you, a lot of media. So talk about what is available on your website, because as I've said before, this is certainly helpful for somebody going through this, but I'm hoping some of our churches will think about the fact that we have a lot of unemployed individuals, and that could be a real ministry, couldn't it?
It really is an opportunity, and I wish the church would be more active and engaged in that. Just as a comparison statistic, 21.7 million people in a year lose a job. About 2.8 million people die each year. Less than 1 million are divorced. So if I'm a parish pastor and I stop and think about the differences, I'm going to have more people unemployed in my congregation. They just don't talk much about it. And so it's important that the church is more proactive, asking, what can we do? Let us know when you're unemployed. On my website, we do have the Bible study for those who are going through unemployment, which is a great outreach opportunity for congregations. We do some discounts on the book because, candidly, every pastor should have a dozen of those sitting in their desk drawer for the day they meet with the person to be able to give them something tangible. Often churches do a food bank, so they're dealing with the issue of people needing food, but forgetting that they don't have food because they don't have a job and they need help in that. So what are some other areas that they can do? I have a number of free downloads on the site that'll help someone, just things like what happens if my spouse loses a job, how do I support them? How do I help a friend? What do I do if it happens to me so that I react in a positive way? So there's a lot of good, helpful information for people on the website.
Well, again, it is all available at our website, pointofview.net, and it's dalekreienkamp.com. And appreciate you writing the book, and I really appreciate you giving us some time today to really talk about this important issue, and it's one that sometimes is hidden and needs to be exposed. If for no other reason, some of you that maybe have lost your job and are afraid to tell anybody, Dale just shared with you that maybe by telling people, you might find another job. By hiding it, which is the natural inclination, you're not helping yourself and, of course, not working your way through some of the emotions we've talked about. So, Dale, thank you for joining us and appreciate you being on the program with us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thanks for having me as your guest, and thanks for tackling this subject, because it is a subject that people just don't like to talk about, and I so appreciate the opportunity to share because there are so many who need help.
Well, again, we wanted to make that available because it's an issue that I think needs to be addressed. And as you pointed out, more than 20 million people lose their jobs every year. That number almost doubled during the pandemic and the lockdown, and we may be dealing with that even next year. So that's all the more reason to focus some time and attention on that. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we're going to be talking with our good friend Rod Dreher. Back in October, we talked about his book, Live Not by Lies. That is a phrase which we'll explain in just a minute. It's where we've talked about this idea of soft totalitarianism, which is coming more from the private sector than the public sector. But we'll talk about that briefly. But he's also been writing about, for example, one of the articles we posted, what I saw at the Jericho March. He wrote that in the American Conservative. And there are just some kind of bizarre things taking place right now, sometimes on the Christian right or just on the right, that I think we need to address. And if nothing else, as he pointed out in one of the pieces, I didn't write a piece called Live Not by Leftist Lies. I wrote about Live Not by Lies. And sometimes we have problems even in the Christian community with some of the things that are said and done and some of the actions being taken. So we're going to have that conversation. And, of course, if you'd like to join us, agree or disagree, 1-800-351-1212. Be right back.
I am tired. 2020 has been a hard year for most of us, and the reality is that 2021 will arrive with its own set of uncertainties. About the only thing that we know for sure is that seeing every issue, every challenge through biblically trained eyes will be sorely needed. And that is what you provide to people all across this nation and right here at home as you support Point of View Radio. People are tuning in. They're listening for longer times than before. It reveals that we're all desperate for fresh, rational, reliable, honest, hope-filled perspectives. And that's what you find on Point of View. Without you, that doesn't happen. But with you, hope will flow, and doubly so right now. Every dollar you give right now will be matched up to $100,000. Please give today at pointofview.net/year-end or call 1-800-347-5151. Keep fighting with us. Give today. Pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we'll bring Rod Dreher back to the program. If you might remember, back in October, we did an interview with him. And then I actually did a couple of Viewpoints commentaries, one based on the book Live Not by Lies, and also then one that related to something in the book, Hannah Rundt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. And we've been talking about him ever since, and oftentimes have talked about this idea of soft totalitarianism. Then I did a Viewpoints commentary last week for a couple of reasons. First of all, I've seen all sorts of people talking about his book, and that would include people like our good friend John Stonestreet, who did a Breakpoint commentary about that, Kelly Shackelford, who joins us usually on Fridays. Actually, he and his wife are doing a Bible study on the book. Matter of fact, I was online with them last Thursday. They're going to do it again tomorrow night. And so that certainly just emphasized again the need to talk about the book. And so we'll mention that for a few minutes in case some of you are not familiar with it, because it is certainly one that is a must read. But then I wanted to move into some of the pieces that he has written for the American Conservative. We've posted one, What I Saw at the Jericho March. And even though we did have an interview before the march with one of the founders of that organization, one of the people that had the vision for it, there are just a lot of disturbing things that have come out of that. And I've noticed that Rod has even talked about the fact that, you know, if he had to rewrite his book, he might not only just talk about some of the radicalism and idiocy on the left, but some of it's surfacing on the right. After all, it's not live not by leftist lies, it's live not by lies. So I wanted to bring you back to the program, and of course, if you have some comments or questions, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. Rod Dreher, of course, is the senior editor of the American Conservative. We have in the past, of course, talked about his book with him, The Benedict Option, and before that was Crunchy Cons, and of course, this book, Live Not by Lies. And so, Rod, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, it's great to be back with you.
And again, for a minute, I thought we'd talk about the book before we get into some of the very insightful and, I could be honest, disturbing articles in the American Conservative, because really the premise of the book is simple, and that is that we are facing a time in which we're moving into totalitarianism, but it's nothing like the so-called old totalitarianism under communist Russia or even under Nazi Germany. But it is what you call a soft totalitarianism, which is really coming from progressive groups. And you're not going to be handcuffed and drug off to a gulag, but you may lose your social media account, you may lose your job, you may lose your opportunity to pursue a degree on a university because you don't agree with, and then fill in the blank, leftist beliefs about race, gender, sexual orientation, and that we can maybe learn some lessons vicariously from some of those saints, some of those Christians who had to suffer under the old form of totalitarianism as we face the soft totalitarianism. Is that a fair summary of your book?
It is a fair summary of the book. And one thing I would add, and this is something that conservatives especially need to be aware of, is that maybe the main advocate of this soft totalitarianism is a big business. That's something that is different from the way I was raised. I'm 53. I was raised in the Reagan years, came of age politically in the Reagan years and the end of the Cold War. And we saw the enemy as primarily the state. Well, now big business has become so woke and it has so much power in this country that it is pushing, major corporations are pushing
this radical progressive agenda too. So, but that's something that it's really hard for Christians and conservatives of my age and older to grasp.
And I think you said very well in the book that the original argument was, well, it's just crazy on the campus. Matter of fact, before I did this job, I used to speak on college campuses all the time, and I'd say, oh, boy, you can't even believe some of the bizarre things that are being said there. But the way in which I think a lot of Christians and even maybe more conservative-oriented parents is, well, wait till those kids get out of college, and then they hit the harsh reality, and that'll straighten them up. And instead, no, they ended up taking positions in business and now have turned some of these corporations into a kind of a woke platform, not unlike what you found on the college campus. So, again, a lot of people didn't see that coming, did they?
No, we did see it coming. You know, I hear from a lot of a lot of progressives who criticize me. They say you're exaggerating about business. Big business always makes profit the bottom line. That just isn't true. And I quote in Live Not by Lies, leaders in corporations. There's a guy, Larry Fink at BlackRock, who is one of the top corporate figures in America, talking about how progressive cultural politics means good business. Well, look, it's just not true, but this is what they tell themselves. And you can never go broke overestimating the desire for corporate leaders to be respected by their peers.
And again, that's an important part of that as well. One other point I thought we'd make, and then, of course, I want to move into some of your articles, is that you've sort of identified what I think is kind of the watershed event. And I've talked about this with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford, and I think we even talked about this with David French last time he was in studio and all the rest. And that is going back to Indiana. It's also helpful to remember that the governor at that time was Mike Pence, and they had the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And I've tried to point out to some of my younger listeners, since I'm the old guy around the table, that when the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was put forward in 1993, the Senate sponsor was Ted Kennedy, the House sponsor was Chuck Schumer. It wasn't really even controversial. ACLU, if I remember right, supported it as well. And so it wasn't really that controversial back then. But then when they wanted to implement the same Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it was a little different, to be fair. In Indiana, I mean, there's where the threats are. You know, you had corporations wanting to shut down offices in Indiana. The NCAA threatened to move the Final Four basketball tournament. There were people threatened with boycotts. You even talk about the poor pizza parlor, which we talked about here on the air, where they were threatened to burn it down and to attack people. And so since that time, now we've seen the cancel culture. And in some respects, that's why you're warning us about this soft totalitarianism that might unfold here on this country.
Well, that's exactly right. 2015 and the Indiana RFRA debacle was a real Waterloo for religious and cultural conservatives, precisely because big business got involved for the first time at that decisive level in the culture war. Ever since then, religious liberty has been seen by big business and by many people who run institutions, not necessarily foaming at the mouth progressives, but just respectable middle-class institutionalists. They see the words religious liberty and think bigotry. And we've seen this year the Supreme Court ruled in the Bostock case about transgender rights, rolling back religious liberty even more. I don't know where it stops, but this is the thing. Christians have got to stop taking our religious liberty for granted. And the fact that the state, the courts are siding more and more with LGBT folks and seeing it as a civil rights issue, and that's more important than religious liberty, this is going to have a long-term impact. And as you say, younger generations who have not been raised to think religious liberty is just a given of American life, they're not going to see the threat either. They're growing up and they're being acculturated in some ways by their churches and certainly by professional middle-class culture and university culture to think of traditional Christianity as something harmful to society.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, one of the articles we posted here, what I saw at the Jericho March, and I think it's illustrative of some of the conversation we're going to have today. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
This is Christmas week, and I thought it might be worthwhile to spend a moment to reflect on the words of the hymn, O Little Town of Bethlehem. It was written in 1867 by Philip Brooks, an Episcopal pastor from Philadelphia. He was in Israel 2 years earlier and had celebrated Christmas in Bethlehem, and he wrote this song to reflect on what that night of the birth of Jesus might be like. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. Above thy deep and dreamless sleep the silent stars go by. Yet in the dark streets shineth the everlasting light. The hopes and fears of all the years are met in thee tonight. You know, while the streets of our cities are quiet on Christmas Day, most likely that day was just like any other day for the people in Bethlehem. But as evening came, the town grew quiet, and something remarkable took place. In the second verse, the hymn says, While mortals sleep, the angels keep their watch of wondering love. Just like today, our world goes about its business, usually oblivious to the spiritual realities around it. Jesus came into the world quietly. Yes, there was the angelic announcement to the shepherds, but most other people were unaware of the fact that the most significant event in history was taking place. God became man. But he was born in a stable and laid in a feeding trough. There was no pomp or circumstance as you might expect of a king. Jesus came not only to live among us, but to ultimately die for our sins. He took upon himself the sins of the world, your sins and my sins, and paid the ultimate penalty that we deserve to pay that we might have everlasting life. During this Christmas week, I hope you'll stop long enough to consider what happened in that little town of Bethlehem. But even more so, I hope you will think about what Jesus did for you on Calvary. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continuing our conversation with Dreher today. Again, his book is Live Not by Lies, but one of the things I want to point to is the series of articles that he's had coming out in the American Conservative. I have this particular one that's on the website, and if you want to print it out, very insightful, but make sure you have a lot of paper in your printer because it goes on for some time. December 12th, What I Saw at the Jericho March. Of course, 2 days before, he had one on Eric Metaxas' American Apocalypse, but let's talk about the Jericho March because you actually watched all 6 hours of the Jericho March proceedings. I don't know if we should give you combat pay or whatever, but it raises some questions, and it's a series of questions that I think around the table we've had before. Sometimes you go to the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, you go to the Christian Booksellers Convention. I'm sure you've done one or two of those before, and you come away going, I don't feel so good about everything that's part of that. And this was even worse from reading what you have there. And it, I think, is one of the reasons why I've heard you say, or at least I've seen you write, that if you had to rewrite your book, Live Not by Lies, you might have spent some more time talking about not just the left, but the right, because there's a lot of almost insanity showing up there, too, isn't there?
Well, that's right. And it burdened my heart to talk about this in my writing, to talk about it with you, Kerby, because these are my people. Religious conservatives are my people. But what I saw there that day, I watched on TV, it really deeply troubled me. And the reason I decided to watch it in the first place was I had seen earlier in the week my old friend Eric Metaxas being interviewed by Charlie Kirk, the conservative activist, on his show. And Eric said that the election was stolen and that Christians have to fight, quote, to the last drop of blood to preserve Trump's presidency. And he said Christians who don't agree are like the quote-unquote good Germans who sat by while Hitler took power. That absolutely shocked me because I'm somebody who, as a conservative, I voted conservative in the race, but I don't think it has been proven the election was stolen. But here was my friend Eric, who's one of the kindest, most gentle Christians I know, saying that we need to be prepared to shed blood for the sake of Donald Trump's presidency. So, and by the way, Charlie Kirk asked him, well, what do you think about the court cases coming up? Eric said, well, I don't know anything about it. I'm thrilled, he said, not to know anything about it. What shook me up, Kerby, was the idea that here's a man who's an influential and intelligent evangelical saying that we should prepare to shed blood for a cause that he can't even defend when he is asked about it. That's why I watched the Jericho March, and I'm afraid to say that everything I saw for the whole 6 hours there only deepened my concern.
And again, we can take it point by point, but one of the key that runs through this is this idea that I have a vision, or Eric Metaxas wouldn't say I have a vision because, but our charismatic friends would say, well, we've had this vision. And there are all sorts of people I enjoy having on this program. And one of those is Michael Brown. And he a while back wrote and said, look, you know, I'm a charismatic. I've spoken in tongues. I've a leading apologist for a charismatic movement and all that. So in some respects, it's better for him to speak to that issue. And he said, what do we do with these individuals who have made these prophetic statements that they guarantee that Joe Biden will not spend a single day in the White House, that they guarantee that Donald Trump will be reelected? Of course, we'll see what happens on January 6th. And that's the other reason I wanted to talk about the Jericho March, because I think you're going to have a replay of this on January 6th when they talk about the certification of the Electoral College vote. And these kind of comments that say, I know I've had this gut feel, I've had this vision, and so let's neglect the facts. If there's anything that those of us that are evangelical Christians say is, no, we believe in apologetics, we believe in the facts, we believe in evidence, and when people start saying, no, I'll just believe in some kind of vision or gut feeling, that puts us in a bad situation, and that seemed to surface a couple of times in the Jericho March, didn't it?
Yeah, it surfaced a lot. Eric Metaxas, he was the MC of the Jericho March. He introduced Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, who also claimed to have visions. Eric introduced the two founders of the march, who said that they founded the event because God sent them visions. God woke one of them up in the middle of the night with a poke in the side and gave him a vision for the march. Eric said, and this is a quote, I wrote it down. He said, when God gives you a vision, you can't question it. And that just is unnerving to me because there's no way to test it against Scripture. There's no idea about how we need to be humble and talk at least with our pastors, with other wise people to discern. They just act on what they feel in their heart is right. General Flynn, Mike Flynn, came up to give his speech. He was the big hero of the march. He told the crowd, don't listen to your mind, listen to your heart, listen to your gut instinct. That's how you can tell truth and falsity. Well, Kerby, this is the sort of thing that people like me and you, like we say about the left all the time. The left is the party driven by feelings, and the left is a party saying that, well, if somebody feels that you've been racist to them, then you objectively have been racist to them, and on and on. When I see this same sort of thing emerge on the religious right, I start to panic because I feel like there's no solid ground anymore.
You know, and this whole idea, when God gives you a vision, you don't need to know anything else. You and I have a similar background in that I didn't grow up in the evangelical subculture. When you're born in Berkeley, California, okay, not a lot of evangelical subculture there, but I remember when you had this experience years ago, and I'll let you fill in the gaps, and you explained that to your wife, and I think her reaction was, you didn't grow up in this evangelical subculture, that's totally normal, and you're starting to see some of this, which I've seen in previous decades. And when it unfolds, I think we should certainly speak to it and begin to say, this is not exactly what the scriptural view is in terms of making the case for the truthfulness of the gospel and making the case for the truthfulness of our political positions where we apply biblical principles to those positions. Fair?
That's right. That's totally fair. Yeah, my wife did grow up in an evangelical subculture, and she, as well as other evangelicals who read my blog post and have written to me, talk about how they were told that they had to go out and change the world, but nobody really told them what they had to do. But they sure knew that they had to be on fire for Christ to transform culture. Look, I believe that too. I'm a Christian. I believe that we Christians have to be active in the world to make the world a more godly place. But the idea that we should just go on whatever our heart tells us, that can be really, really dangerous. I remember in my childhood when The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey was the big book that everybody read. I wasn't an evangelical, but I did read that book when I was 13, and it scared me to death. I began to read the newspaper every day through this prophetic lens. Well, all the things Hal Lindsey said were going to happen did not happen. And but there are people who still believe it, are still waiting for these things to happen. Meanwhile, there are a lot of people in my generation who walked away from the church because they saw it as nothing more than a cult that existed to scare people.
And that's something we're going to be talking about in the future, because I wanted to have you on, but I believe we got Michael Horton coming on. I believe we got David French on and some others that are just saying, first of all, this isn't great optics, to put it mildly, but it isn't also very good biblical ideas. And if you want to keep scaring people away from the gospel and having people become disappointed because the vision didn't happen, or because you are convinced that we're in a totally corrupt society, we're not going to make any progress. And I recognize that many of us maybe say, well, maybe we are ready for the Benedict option that you've written about, but I'm not so sure everybody's going to be in the Benedictine gathering with us or any better sometimes than the people that we've been criticizing. And as I think you've said more than once, look, I wrote this book called Live Not by Lies, not Live Not by Leftist Lies, because we have on this program, and you have many times, pointed out some of the most bizarre things said by the leftist. But when you start seeing some of the same kind of things being said by the right, I think it's time to come out and speak to that issue. So let's take a break. We come back, we're going to get into a little more of the detail where this might take us. And if you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, that's okay. We would certainly want to give you that opportunity. And Rod Dreher's book is one that I have been recommending. As a matter of fact, just the other day, there was a devotion that they asked me to do, and I did it on the book. And I said, I know we're going to, first of all, read a number of verses about persecution and what the Bible says about persecution. We're going to talk about a manual for Christian dissidents, but I think it's something that prepares us for the future, because if that soft totalitarianism is going to come from the private sector and from corporations, what happens when the government, given the fact that there may be different individuals in the Oval Office and in the cabinet, want to reinforce that, or some of the people in the cabinet come from Silicon Valley? What does that mean? So I think we need to be prepared for what the future might hold, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to have Rod Dreher on to talk about these issues, and also to give you a chance to make some comments. And so agree or disagree, if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll come back and have more right after this.
We all love buy one, get one free, and I've got a deal like that to tell you about. But first, as you listen to the news, do you ever feel like you're living in a different world from some people? The expert on one channel says something totally opposite from the expert on another. Finding the truth usually takes being willing to challenge both sides. It requires discernment, inspired by commitment to God's Word, and a willingness to do your own research. And that describes Kerby Anderson and the team here at Point of View Radio. We are reaching a lot of people in these days of lockdowns and restrictions, and your support reaches even more right now during our $100,000 matching challenge. You invest, and whatever you give is doubled up to $100,000. It's sort of like buy one, get one free. So please give today at pointofview.net/year-end or call 1-800-347-5151. Make a big difference. Pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join the conversation. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Rod Dreher with us. And let me just, if nothing else, put a few things in context. First of all, we have respect for some of the people we've been talking about. We mentioned Eric Metaxas just a minute ago, and he's been on the program with us many times before. I've known him for years, and we've interacted in a number of different ways. And this maybe fits under the category that you see in Proverbs 27, where it talks about the wounds of a friend are faithful. And so, again, not trying to be critical. As a matter of fact, the piece that Rod wrote even says, look, nothing here should be interpreted as a personal attack on him, but some of these ideas are important and need to be considered. If you're saying, well, don't we have evidence of some problems with the voting? Again, I've tried to be fair. To even today, you can find an article that I've posted, which kind of gives you a summary of Peter Navarro's 36-page report. Now, again, he's part of the Trump administration, arguing for some kind of voter fraud. The other day, we actually posted some of the information from Russell Ramsland, who's right here actually in the Dallas area with Allied Security Operations, questioning the Dominion audit. And yet, at the same time today, we've posted a piece by Andrew McCarthy on what he calls a whopper of an election rigging claim. So those are issues, both point and counterpoint, that we try to give you information that, frankly, some that are on one side won't talk about, ones on the other side won't talk about, and I think we need to provide some context for what's taking place. And especially when we're talking about this, a claim is not proof. I mean, Proverbs 18, verse 17, for example, the person who states a claim or states a case seems truthful until another comes and examines him. And so we really do need a place where we can maybe evaluate some of the claims, some of these affidavits and things. And so far, a lot of the courts have actually just eliminated them. But, Rod, that's different than claiming that I am sure that this election was stolen and we need to fight to the last drop of our blood for this particular election misjudgment or mischievousness or even kind of fraud, when we don't have the kind of evidence that would be necessary in order to overturn an election, right?
No, that's right. That's completely right. I had a conversation a couple of weeks back with some conservative lawyer friends. They're all Christians. They're all Republican voters. I'm sure most of them I know voted for Trump. But they were telling me that when you actually look at the cases that Trump's legal team has filed, they're very different from the things that Trump's legal team has been saying in their press conference.
Very true.
This is the kind of thing that unless you've had a legal training, you don't understand it. I can't understand it. I'm just a journalist with no legal training. So it was really discouraging to these conservative lawyer friends because they believed that the Trump team was scamming people and scaring good Christian conservative people when it actually didn't have a case at all. Now, we heard at the Jericho March people talking about wanting Trump to invoke martial law, the Insurrection Act, to get the result they want. That's terrifying because our founding fathers gave us a system for adjudicating these competing claims. It's in the Constitution. The court systems are constitutionally ordained to handle these things. It doesn't mean that they're going to get it right all the time. The Supreme Court, ruled in favor of abortion. It has ruled in favor in the past of Dred Scott. It doesn't guarantee we get it right, but it does guarantee that we have an orderly, rational way of dealing with these things. Christians overturn this at our peril.
Well, and again, I think Christians should be the primary example of ideal citizens in terms of voting and being respectful, obviously being willing to agree to disagree, speaking the truth in love. All of that is part of what it means. But let's take some phone calls. I want to give some of you a chance to join the conversation. So we'll head up to Maine first. And Steve, thank you for joining us today. You're on with Rod Dreher.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I was kind of blown away by that information about Eric Metaxas. I've listened to him many times on your shows. I've read his book and recommend it highly on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and I agree with on that side of it, what he was saying, that where the book kind of parallels closely what's going on in our society and in our government right now. Totally, I'll just ignore everything else because I don't know anything about his, standing as far as, visions or what have you. I just, whatever. I feel like if that wasn't seen by 100 other people, then what use is it? Just the way I say, the same way I feel about tongues.
Yeah. And again, I'm not trying to be anti-charismatic because, like I said, I quoted from an individual who's kind of known as a charismatic spokesperson, and that is Michael Brown. So we've had him on the program, and he's just saying, guys, you have told me that these are ironclad visions, and you guarantee this, and it's not. And he says, now don't come back also and tell me, well, we didn't pray enough. He said, look, we've probably had more prayer meetings than anything else. And he says, this is something we're going to have to come to grips with. And I appreciate the fact that he's willing to say that because he's in a situation where he can say it better than you and I.
And you summarized everything that I've been actually thinking about talking about for the last couple of days when I've called into your program, and you summarized them quite clearly just before this segment. And I look at the same news that you guys are looking at, and I read the same stories, and I'm questioning, why is there differences in something that you're hearing about the numbers and all of a sudden the thousands of ballots that are showing up after the voting poll places have closed, and all those kind of stories that now, which wishy-washy? What do you listen to? What's true? And there's a lot to question, I think.
Sure.
I don't think it's I don't think it's wise to just all of a sudden jump in and throw in the towel. At the same time, I think, like you said, you have to let's be 100% certain that we're not going to be made fools of when we make a claim that it's verifiable.
Very well said. And again, I don't deny there's fraud, Rod Dreher, because I believe in human sin nature, and we had a fair amount of fraud even during the Democratic primaries in 2020. One election had to be redone. They had to get a milligan on that. Another election, 12th Congressional District in New York, was so bad that finally a judge, kind of like the ancient King Solomon, just simply said, well, you're going to be the winner because we can't sort out all the fraud that was taking place. So I recognize that there's some fraud. Whether it's enough to justify overturning the election, let's wait and see. But what I think you and I are reacting to is this absolute guarantee that this was stolen when you don't have as much evidence as you thought, because as you point out, as those lawyers point out, a lot of the particular cases before the judges, because I'm not a lawyer, but I get to interview them and I get to read some of this, were more process questions, not necessarily allegations of fraud. And that's why I think maybe some of the people are overreacting to some of the material we have so far.
Well, that's right. And watching the Jericho March and listening to a lot of this rhetoric reminds me of that famous scene in the movie A Man for All Seasons.
Yes.
It came out in the 60s, where Sir Thomas More, who is on trial for his life because he wouldn't accept the king's divorce, he is having an argument with his son-in-law, Roper. And Roper says that we have to go get the devil here, and we have to cut down all the laws of England to get to the devil. Thomas More looks at him and says, so if you cut down all the laws of England to get to the devil, and the devil turns on you, where are you going to hide having cut down all the laws?
Yes.
I think that's really important for us here, because when Christians are making these rash statements about being willing to fight to the last drop of blood and declaring martial law and things like that, this is something we haven't heard, certainly not from the right in this country. And what are Christians going to do? Because we conservative Christians are a minority in this country now. A lot of Christians don't want to see that, and we are making ourselves into a hated minority. David French is really big on this. We're going to have to depend on First Amendment jurisprudence to protect our rights when we become a hated, unpopular minority.
Well said. It's funny. I was actually watching some YouTube clips of Man for All Season because I was thinking the same thing you were. So let's get back to the phones here in South Carolina, WLPE. Jack, thank you for joining us today.
Yes, I'll try to say this succinctly, but I'm perfectly happy with. I won't say happy, but I'm ready to be hated for the right reasons. I want to be a Christian first, and one of the things that I've brought up to some of my Christian friends is exactly what you guys are talking about this afternoon, and so I asked them this question: do you think it was right for Christians to rebel against the king when we declared independence? Was it the right thing to do for the colonies to declare independence and fight for that?
Okay, we're going to take a break, and we'll come back, and of course that gets us into the whole issue of civil disobedience. I have a booklet on that and written about it, and of course I know Rod will be willing to speak to that issue, so we'll talk about that right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Rod Dreher for a few more minutes. And Rod, he really had 2 points. Jack, first of all, is talking about being hated for the right reasons. And I talk about sometimes Scripture talks about the offense of the cross. And I recognize that even if I'm the most gracious person, godly person, people are still going to be offended because sometimes the cross and the gospel is offensive to people. I understand that. But at least I don't want to be an offensive person. And some of the stridency I saw at the Jericho March and at some of these other rallies of concern. But he raised another question. That is the whole issue of civil disobedience. And since I'm the old guy around the table, I didn't march in the civil rights marches, but I had a Sunday school teacher that did, and actually a neighbor that both marched in Selma. So I grew up kind of thinking about when do you disobey government. And, you read some of the things of Martin Luther King Jr. And then later on, we had things like Operation Rescue and pro-life protest. And I finally concluded that, it seems to me that the scriptures allow us to disobey when there is a direct and specific command that is given to us, which, if obeyed, would cause us to violate Scripture. We'll obey God rather than men, Acts 5:29. But otherwise, I sense sometimes activists, especially Christian activists, are willing to take up arms a little too quickly and fight a little too quickly when sometimes that's not the best strategy. So what are your thoughts? I know you thought about this as well.
Sure. Well, I was thinking as I was watching Alex Jones, the crazy conspiracy theorist, screaming at the Jericho March.
You were thinking what I was, yeah.
Radicals like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking, how far is this from the civil rights marchers? I mean, Dr. King and the other civil rights marchers, they did violate the law through civil disobedience, but they were willing to accept the punishment to demonstrate their commitment to the cause, and they showed the depth of their loyalty to the United States by doing that. They were calling us to be our best selves, and they eventually won. There was nothing in the Jericho March that made one feel proud to be an American or feel like you wanted to sympathize with these people. It was all, to my eyes, about making people angry and even hysterical. And I think that our passions, unrestrained by reason, they're going to undo us, Kirby. They really are. And they're going to end up, if some people get violent over this, some crazy people listen to the rhetoric of folks like Eric Metaxas talking about shedding blood. All it's going to take is one crazy person to carry out an act of violence, and the whole mechanism of the state is going to come down on all Christians very hard. Eric, I saw online, said, in response to me criticizing it, he said, well, I don't stand for violence. I don't approve of violence. Well, then stop saying these things, because there are people out there who don't know that you are speaking hyperbolically for the sake of rhetorical effect. Words matter.
I do, and boy, I so agree with that. And if you've ever been in some of these marches and rallies, and I have, I've been pro-life marches and decency marches and political marches and all that. I've been up to my eyebrows in a lot of that. You know as well as I do, Rod, that sometimes you're marching down the street and then you look to your right or to your left and you see some people and go, I really don't want these people part of this because I'm not sure what they're going to do. So, it's again, words are really important, and I'm kind of looking ahead because there is supposed to be now announced by the president himself a rally. I'm using a nice word because I'm thinking it's going to be more like a protest on January 6th. And, of course, we saw what the resistance looked like. We saw what happened in various cities when people were riled up about George Floyd or whatever the issue might have been at the time. And I think what happens, Rod, sometimes is that you see some radical people on the left say some things, some radical people on the right, and there's all sorts of people in the middle sort of watching these missiles, these verbal missiles go back and forth over their head, and they're saying, I'm not sure I really like either side. And it seems to me that, if anything, Christians should be the most winsome, the most gracious. We should provide evidence for our belief. When we see so many people that simply shout us down and cancel the culture and those kinds of things, we don't overcome evil with evil. We overcome evil with good. And it seems to me that that's kind of what you've been writing about, not only in your books, but even in some of the articles that have appeared here in the American Conservative.
Well, that's right. I try to bring prudence to my deliberations on what we Christians should do. I think back to these heroic Christians who resisted communism. All of them knew that they had no capacity to overthrow a totalitarian state. But they also knew that they could not, in good conscience, conform. So they undertook waves of resistance, modes of resistance that were peaceful and greatly irritated the government and got some of them put in prison. But they provided something higher and better. Václav Havel, who became the first president of a free Czechoslovakia, when the Velvet Revolution was underway, some of the people wanted to get violent with the communists, and the communists had it coming. They deserved it. But Havel said, no, we are not like them. We are better than them. Stand down, friends. And they did, and that's why that country had a bloodless transition.
That's such a great story. And again, some of them are in the book. Maybe one more phone call. Again, apologize if some of you didn't get through, but there's always tomorrow. You can call in and still address some of these issues. Alex in Georgia, we'll make you the last call for today.
Hello, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you for taking my call. My question is, there is knowledge and there are feelings, and God has given us both for a reason. But how do we know when the Holy Spirit is speaking to us, not our own feelings and not our own thoughts?
Good point. That probably is deserving of an entire program, but it seems to me that first you can certainly say that if you ever have feelings or unctions or emotions that violate Scripture, I think, Rod, we can all agree those don't fit. And sometimes when you have this idea of a vision or a calling, there is wisdom in many counselors. So maybe go to other godly people and say, this is what I think God is telling me about this particular issue. Maybe it's to pursue this line of work, or maybe step out and build a business or whatever it might be. And it deserves probably a longer answer, but I do believe that there are a couple of at least guardrails there of making sure that what you feel is certainly in line with Scripture, and maybe also checking it out with other godly men and women in your life to make sure that you're not off base. So those are at least a couple of things I might suggest. Any others?
I completely agree with that, Kerby. And I would also say that in my own tradition, which is Eastern Orthodoxy, we are taught that these things can happen, that God can speak to you individually. But we're taught to distrust it initially because it could be just your own conscience speaking, or it could be the devil. He comes as an angel of light.
Sure.
So healthy skepticism is not ungodly. And this, as it turns out, is something that goes back to the beginning of my friendship with Eric Metaxas. He and I were getting to know each other in the late 1990s, walking around Manhattan. This is before he became a big deal. And we were arguing about some very minor theological point, and Eric said, well, I feel that God has said this to me. I said, well, how do you reconcile that with Scripture and da-da-da-da-da? And he honestly didn't know what I was talking about. Eric felt so strongly that he had had the Word of God put on his heart that he didn't have to think about it. I love Eric, and I just chalk this up to a fundamental difference between him as a charismatic and me. I was Catholic at the time, but I heard that conversation. It came back to mind watching Eric stand on stage at the Jericho March, telling people just to go with their gut and to believe it when God sends them a vision.
Well, if nothing else, I would encourage our listeners to maybe just print out or read the What I Saw at the Jericho March. And at the end, if you say, I feel really good about that, I'm sure you won't, then maybe you understand why we're talking about this. And this won't be the only time we'll be talking about it. But Rod Dreher, again, I encourage people to read what I think one of the best books of this year, Live Not by Lies, A Manual for Christian Dissidents. And so thank you for writing the book, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby, and Merry Christmas to you and to all your listeners.
Merry Christmas. I want to thank Doug for his help as an engineer, Steve for his help as a producer, and hope you'll join us tomorrow right here on Point of View.
I am tired. 2020 has been a hard year for most of us, and the reality is that 2021 will arrive with its own set of uncertainties. About the only thing that we know for sure is that seeing every issue, every challenge through biblically trained eyes will be sorely needed. And that is what you provide to people all across this nation and right here at home as you support Point of View Radio. People are tuning in. They're listening for longer times than before. It reveals that we're all desperate for fresh, rational, reliable, honest, hope-filled perspectives. And that's what you find on Point of View. Without you, that doesn't happen. But with you, hope will flow, and doubly so right now. Every dollar you give right now will be matched up to $100,000. Please give today at pointofview.net/year-end or call 1-800-347-5151. Keep fighting with us. Give today. Pointofview.net/year-end and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.